The downfall of Tears of the Kingdom was one of the most interesting things to witness in the history of gaming, simply because of the way that it panned out. As soon as the clock struck midnight on the 23rd of May 2023, the most harsh game critics were projectile vomiting 10 out of 10 reviews like they had just got food poisoning. This initial wave of Tears glazing got so bad that if anyone dared to question the majority, they would be considered blasphemous. It was just like this for its predecessor Breath of the Wild, and just because the community refused to accept these first negative reviews, it didn't necessarily mean that these opinions went away. It's like trying to hold a balloon underwater. Eventually, the pressure becomes so great that everything rises to the surface. Fast forward to today, over 1 year since the game's release, it's become extraordinarily rare to find a positive Tears of the Kingdom review, at least in my experience. I played Tears of the Kingdom to death and loved each and every second of it, so it made me question, where did it all go wrong? This question intrigued me so much that over the past few weeks, I've gathered the biggest problems that the community has expressed, and I intend on fixing them. I thought it would be interesting for me to give suggestions on how Nintendo could have handled things differently, which I hope is interesting and fun to watch coming from a new perspective. By no means am I a game developer or somebody that is remotely clued up in this regard, but I do understand there's certain aspects of a game that can make it enjoyable. My intention is to fix these problems while remaining as true to the original game as I can, and just to be clear, Tears was so close to being everything Breath of the Wild should have been, but there were some very questionable decisions made that made it fall short of player expectations. So with all that said, let's start with the biggest complaint I've seen from a Zelda game. The first issue arises with regards to the story of Tears. I and many others love the story itself, but the structure used to convey that story is where the problem lies. When it comes to storytelling in any sort of media, whether that be movies, TV shows, or in this case, video games, there are two main ways of conveying that story. Firstly is linear storytelling, where every scene, act, or event is told chronologically, and everything happens in order. Both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's main story make use of this linear storytelling structure, with no issues there. However, the issues started to surface when the second storytelling structure was introduced. This is non-linear storytelling. Non-linear storytelling is just the story taking place outside of chronological order. However, both memory quest lines were supposed to be watched in chronological order. The non-linear aspect was completely unintentional. The massive problem with this is that it was entirely possible to find and watch the memories out of order, spoiling things both in the memory quest line as well as a large portion of the main story. Luckily, I wasn't affected by this, as I happened to discover them in the exact order they were supposed to be watched, but it seems the vast majority of the community wasn't so fortunate. As for a solution, it may not be as simple as people might think at first glance. And the most popular solution I've seen was to make the memories play in order, no matter which one you stumbled across, but I don't think this would have been such a simple thing to implement, mainly because all the geoglyph symbols are related to the topic of the memory, as well as the location being where the memory takes place. Special music also plays according to which geoglyph you are visiting, as it tells a different stage of the story.
When you're exploring any geoglyph locations, geoglyph music loops. But before it loops back to the beginning, several strange notes specific to that location play. Some have known for a while that these notes are actually a section of Tears of the Kingdom's main theme song when put in chronological order. It's tough to imagine it when they're singular notes on their own, so here's the whole rendition I sped up with maintained pitch and stitched together for you so you can hear the side-by-side reference for clarity.
While most people would argue that these are pretty minor things to justify not using such a simple fix to the problem, others can argue that these small Easter eggs collectively make up a huge part of the game. So here's how I would fix it. I would implement a system that locks memories behind a certain progression point. I would still keep the geoglyphs, but make it so that the players can only discover memories at different points within their playthrough. This is because the events in the memories not only affect the memory quest line, but the main quests as well. The first few memories of the game, including Where Am I and An Unfamiliar World, would be accessible as soon as the player drops into Hyrule. However, the later geoglyphs, like the Birth of the Demon King, would simply not be on the map. Tears of the Kingdom is not a stranger to the system, which can be seen by the enemy variants. At the beginning of a playthrough, all scalable enemies such as Bokoblins, Lizalfos, and Horblins will be in their base form. As the player advances through the story, collects better armor, and becomes more experienced, the enemies upgrade in variants, going from red to blue to black, and finally to silver. So here's the blueprint. The first 3 memories would be available from the very beginning of the game. Memories 4 and 5 would be available after completing 1 of the 4 regional phenomena, Memory 6 would be available after the 2nd dungeon, 7 and 8 after the 3rd, 9 after the 4th, 10 and 11 would be available after beating the Spirit Temple, and then of course the final memory, number 12, would appear after watching all previous memories. To make their appearance less jarring, the geoglyphs would be progressively drawn into the map as the player advances through the game. The community also complains about how they don't want to sit around watching a 3-minute long cutscene, which I do understand to a certain degree, but I don't think this is a very reasonable thing to complain about. The vast majority of the game's progression is driven by you as a player. In fact, all of the main story quests are like this, so I won't even begin to try and address that. 1, because it would create a vastly different game, which I specifically said I did not want to do, and 2, because I really enjoyed the story that the memories told. Ugh, the performance. This has been somewhat of a hotly contested topic on this channel because it seems that everyone else experienced no issues whatsoever. Now, the thing is that I believe there wasn't much Nintendo could have done in order to fix this. This is mainly due to the fact that they already compressed Tears down to 16 gigabytes. However, I would have made a big change that I think a lot of people wouldn't appreciate. Nintendo releasing their most anticipated game of all time on possibly one of their worst performing consoles was very ill-advised in my opinion. It is still really impressive that a game of this scale can even run somewhat smoothly on this terrible piece of hardware, but I still would have moved it onto a newer console. Porting the game to the Switch 2 would have easily fixed a lot of issues I saw in this game. Pop-ins, frame dips, asset swapping, etc. However, the main problem with this is that the console hasn't come out yet. Yes, it would mean that we would have to wait longer for Tears to release, but it also means that Nintendo wouldn't have had to sacrifice quality of life features to allow it to run easier on their older hardware. Overall, I feel like no matter what I say on this topic, there's gonna be at least one person that disagrees with me, but believe me, I'm done flogging this dead horse. Breath of the Wild introduced an amazing combat system and it was brilliantly upgraded and refined in Tears, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a whole new list of problems. Now, this issue for me isn't something that originated in Tears, but rather persisted from Breath of the Wild. My issue with combat is that there isn't a real sense of danger. I'm not saying the enemies are weak or anything of the sort. I mean, 2 or 3 hits from a Lionel and I was killed in less than 30 seconds. What I am saying is that the fact that you can pause the fight, eat endless amounts of food and restore your health completely takes any sort of urgency away from the fight at hand. Technically, Tears already fixed this with the addition of depths enemies. No matter how much damage they do in a single hit, it will permanently steal a heart until replenished by a light root. But if I'm being honest, fights in the depths made up a tiny percentage of the total combat I participated in. As for a solution, it is pretty simple. Once the player enters any sort of combat, you cannot pause or go into any inventory for at least 15 seconds after the enemy or group of enemies have been defeated. Of course, you could still use quick swap to change weapons as to not make fights impossible, but this very easily fixes this issue. This also fixes being able to teleport out of combat if you feel overwhelmed, as well as loading a save in the same situation. Aside from that, I found myself heavily relying on a horrifically broken mechanic being flurry rushes. Flurry rushes are a spur of hits, triggered after dodging an enemy's attacks. They are supposed to trigger after a perfect dodge and thus are super overpowered, but the window in which Link can initiate a flurry rush is absurdly big. In some cases, I could dodge after an enemy's attack had finished and still get a flurry rush. Firstly, this trivialized any normal fighting styles, as well as disincentivizing these several creative and fun ways to deal with enemies. Solutions for this can be tricky, however. On the one hand, I love this mechanic and it made fights all the more enjoyable, but on the other hand, it made all the methods of combat turn into a chore. For example, in the final fight against Ganon, his attacks were very fast and do a lot of damage, so my first instinct was to do a flurry rush, only to realize that Ganon could flurry rush me instead. This caught me so off guard, and other than the fact that Ganon had a memeish amount of health, made combat an actual challenge. This was a massive step in the right direction on Nintendo's part, and I think this counter flurry rush system should have been implemented into regular enemies as well. I would also greatly decrease the window in which a dodge could be considered a perfect dodge, and make Link do less hits once he initiates a flurry rush. This would make combat a lot more spur of the moment and constantly challenge people's approach to encounters with enemies, thus also allowing the player to make use of all the different fighting styles instead of just one-on-one melee combat. Speaking of melee combat, I can't say I'm the biggest fan either. Firstly, the fact that all the weapons are decayed made me pretty frustrated, because they would only become viable in combat if I stuck something on the end of it. I did really enjoy using Fuse, as it actually gave purpose to the hundreds of monster parts I had in my inventory, but once in a while, I would like just to be able to pick up a pristine weapon and use it like I did in Breath of the Wild. I wouldn't want these weapons to be super common, but not too rare either, because I found diving into the depths just for one weapon that wasn't decayed turned into a massive chore. Secondly, I just wanted to quickly go over weapon degradation. I know we've all heard it 1,000 times, and believe me, I have seen dead horses being flogged more than this topic, but I think some keyboard warriors would yell at me if I didn't mention it. I fall into the apparently miniature camp of people that actually liked this system. The game has hundreds of amazing weapons, not to mention their fuse combinations, so I was never sad when I broke a powerful weapon. Sure, each weapon class has their own modifier, but on the plus side, the more decayed weapons you break, the more pristine versions of the weapons you will find in the depths. Additionally, the enemies are problematic to a certain extent. While most higher tier enemies aren't weak, they all share one common issue. They're all pretty stupid. It's pretty unfortunate that the monsters that were created by Ganondorf himself for the sole purpose of killing Link are lacking any kind of reasonable combat knowledge. There have been multiple accounts where I've walked past an entire group of enemies with guard towers and they all remained completely oblivious to my presence. Like I said before, I am no game designer, so I don't know how to fix enemy AI. However, here are some quick notes. 1. Make the enemies more aware. 2. Get rid of being able to stun lock them. And 3. Add more attacks to the enemies, please. I strongly believe that with these few changes in mind, the combat can become something really special, and in my opinion, almost perfect. My next problem comes with the dungeons and tiers. By no means am I an OG Zelda fan, hell, I still haven't played any of the previous Zelda games, but I do feel that the dungeons need some work. In tiers, there are 152 shrines. This by itself is a pretty unnecessary amount of them, which unfortunately led to some pretty disappointing puzzles. The majority of the shrines were laughably easy, some of which I could complete in less than 30 seconds. And a good chunk of them were blessing shrines. Blessing shrines are the ones that have no puzzle inside of them because the puzzle is getting into the shrine in the first place. On paper, I already did not like this concept, and I disliked it even more when it was implemented. If I experienced any kind of mild difficulty entering the shrine, it would be a blessing. Even if the shrine was just sitting in a cave, I got a free spirit orb. Speaking of shrines and caves, they frustrated me immensely. Cave entrances were pretty easy to come across when I wasn't looking for them, but if I was looking for a cave entrance, it was practically impossible to find. The rest of the blessing shrines were achieved by getting a green rock with a beam that tells you exactly where to take it, and that's kind of it. The whole concept of blessing shrines doesn't sit well with me because shrines themselves are the puzzles. They shouldn't be a puzzle on the outside in the first place. With that being said, what could fix these issues? The first thing I would do is drastically lower the number of shrines to 100 or even 90. Each shrine would have multiple different puzzles, not all relying on the same concept. I would increase the difficulty of these shrines so it takes at least 10 minutes for the player to figure out the solution. To account for the decrease in shrine numbers, the number of spirit orbs per stamina or heart container would be 2, so you could still obtain the same amount of them. As for the major dungeons, I think this was a massive improvement from Breath of the Wild. Not only were each of them memorable, they all had amazing build-up to each one, but the dungeons themselves could use some work. Now, it's important to note that the objectives of the dungeons remained exactly the same to Breath of the Wild. Each dungeon had 4 terminals that needed to be activated in order to stop the problem it caused for the people of Hyrule. Once the terminals are activated, a boss is protecting the problem from disappearing and thus must be defeated. For each dungeon, your companion's ability is needed in order to activate each terminal and is used in the boss fight at the end. This meant you couldn't cheese the puzzles as you needed to guide them throughout the dungeon. As for the Wind Temple, I really liked the build-up. However, the dungeon was a little empty. It is supposed to be this massive ship, but there were no parts in any of the rooms that suggested it was a ship. The rooms were massive but weren't filled with anything. The puzzles to activate the different terminals felt very disjointed. 4 out of the 5 have nothing to do with Tulin's ability and lack a sense of complexity. To fix this, I think the dungeon should have been more sequential, meaning that you can only do each puzzle one after the other. Like in the shrines, it introduces a simple puzzle with a core concept. Then in future puzzles, build on this concept and make it progressively more difficult. There also weren't any pirates, which I think was a massive mistake. The ship is populated by a bunch of choo-choos and Zona constructs, which I thought was pretty lazy. My concept for the pirates would look something like this. It would be similar to the Phantom Pirate from Sea of Thieves, but just covered in ice. They would have a cutlass for melee combat with some pretty simple attack patterns, but they would also have ice crossbows for long-range combat. Additionally, I would place ice ropes over the ship so that the pirates could zipline down to you and start combat quickly. Pirates would patrol their upper decks, while some other pirates were helping below deck, as well as guarding some puzzles. Next is the Water Temple. I really enjoyed the puzzles leading up to the dungeon, mainly the one where I had to shoot the king's fin through a teardrop, but the dungeon itself was something different entirely. I loved the low gravity aspect as it allowed for different puzzles that previously wouldn't have been possible. The dungeon was very separated, with each terminal being pretty easy to activate. I also didn't like the bubble system that they implemented. Instead, I would have implemented bridges made of water that Link could swim up with the Zora armor or on Sidon's back. Speaking of Sidon, I think his ability could have been better. It was just a single attack, which was a blade of water, which I do think has some potential. I would first make the ability last 15 seconds, in which all attacks would be water-based. A spin attack would throw water in all directions, any bow shots would travel faster and do splash damage, parrying a shield would splash the enemy away, as well as shield surfing be available on any surface, and of course melee weapons doing extra damage due to the water. I would also implement a system which involved a combo sequence, like 3 normal hits and then 1 big explosion of water. I know the community has lots of problems with the other dungeons, but I personally don't mind them. With that being said, let's move on to our last major section. The final problem of the video that I've seen time and time again is the map. Now, the map has 3 different dimensions: the sky, the surface, and the depths. The sky was by far the most advertised part of the game, but somehow also one of the most lackluster sections. The first problem was that there were very few sky islands on the entire map, around 20 or so. This problem was compounded by the fact that most of the sky islands were pretty alike. Most of them included a Zona device dispenser and a shrine, and that was extremely boring. Additionally, most of the story took place on the surface, so there wasn't any real reason to explore them. Next is the surface, which I think was fine. It was extremely fun to explore and was absolutely gorgeous. I wouldn't really change much here because the addition of the caves made the surface quite refurbished. Finally, there is the depths. I've spoken about this in previous videos, so I won't talk about it too much here, but the depths is pretty much like the Sky Islands. The depths had pretty much nothing to do outside of some Yiga schematics. The majority of my time was spent going from light route to light route. I do find it a bit confusing that the entirety of the depths is the same biome except for Death Mountain. There could have easily been a frozen section for the Heba region or something like that. On top of that, the depths were an absolute pain to traverse. I understand that the depths were supposed to be the inversion of Hyrule, but having these massive walls all over the place just made exploring super inconvenient. So how would I fix this? Firstly, I would split the story up so that the majority of it takes place on the Sky Islands. I would also make the Sky Islands more abundant and bigger. Then a small portion would happen on the surface and the rest would happen in the depths. This would force people to explore the different areas as well as forcing Nintendo to actually add content to these areas. For the actual maps themselves, I would first change the biome of each sky island, according to which biome it is located over. All the plains or grassy biomes would be just the regular sky island texture. Any islands over Death Mountain would have no grass and that burning atmosphere. Any over the Hebrew region would be frozen, so on and so forth. All in all, Tears of the Kingdom was a great game, and I still continue to play it every day. In fact, I actually started to 100% the game. However, with these changes in mind, the game would remain mostly the same while fixing some of the major issues I had with it. So with all that said, I hope you take my opinions with a grain of salt, because this whole niche is quite subjective. I will be slowing down the production of my videos because, well, my next video is intended to document my 100% experience. So if you want to stick around for that, just know that it will take a while.